Outlining plans for the Second International Assembly. It begins in just a few weeks in Rome. After a two-day retreat for those taking part, the Pope will be leading a penitential ceremony on the evening of October 1st. And the Vatican reports among the sins to be confessed will be the sins against synodality. And cleanup recovery efforts will begin today in the state of North Carolina and the communities there after a massive storm dumping historic amounts of rain across the region. This after a storm system known as Tropical Cyclone 8, dumping up to 18 inches of rain on several coastal communities, flooding roads and forcing hundreds of residents to flee their homes. For more news with a Catholic perspective, visit EWTNnews.com. I'm Teresa Tomeo, and Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders starts now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, we are here to answer that question for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response, and then once you get that response, then you can put in your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. May not, but it may. There you go. Also, you can send us an email if you wish that. ctc@ewtn.com is the address, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, Pedro Quiles, our producer, Matt Kabinski, our phone screener, Rich Jesse handling social media for us. If you'd like to ask a question via YouTube, we are streaming on that platform right now. Just put your question, if you would, in the comments box, and then Rich will see it. He'll shoot it to us here in Studio One, and off we go. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing very well. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
We're going to lead off with an interesting question here. This is from D. Dear Dr. Anders, my husband and I together have been reading your book, The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage. In chapters 5 and 6, you discuss several of the early Christian martyrs and ascetics, such as St. Anthony of Egypt and St. Simeon, the Stylite. How do the lives of these saints line up with what St. Paul has to say in the letter to the Colossians about ascetic practices and severity to the body? He seems to discourage such sacrifices in strong terms, saying, quote, they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. That would be Colossians 2:18 through 23. Would really appreciate your input on this. Thanks, D.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So keep in mind that that practicing asceticism is not something that came into the church with the monastic movement of the 3rd century. Of course, it predates Christianity in that the Old Testament actually mandates certain ascetical practices, in particular fasting, and like the Nazarite vow and things of that sort. But it's also things practiced by our Lord, as well as St. John the Baptist. So remember that John the Baptist ate bugs and wore camel's hair, which, even though my grandfather had a camel's hair sports jacket that was pretty nice, I don't think that's what John the Baptist had in mind. And it was something that was rough and uncomfortable to the skin. And he, seems to have lived in the wilderness and really roughed it up out there. He could have had his own reality TV show back in the day, and it would have been something. And then, of course, our Lord does the same thing, right? I mean, Jesus, I want to follow you. Well, foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests. But the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So he lived a homeless and itinerant life. He lived a poor life. He ate whatever was put in front of him. He didn't, what are you looking for? Somebody that lives in a fine house with fine clothes and fine banquets? He says, no, that's what the rich people are doing. That's not what I'm doing. And he began his public ministry with an extended fast of 40 days in the desert. and specifically said in response to questions about that, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So his own life was deeply ascetical, and he marked it out in the beginning with a profoundly ascetical exercise, and calls us to imitate him. And of course, Christian tradition has always taken not just the passion of the Christ, but Jesus' whole earthly life as a kind of model for Christian spirituality. And so religious life, like St. Anthony's, was inspired by the express words of Jesus: if you want to be perfect, sell what you have, give to the poor, come and follow me. If you want your Father to reward you, go and pray in secret in your room. So the monastic life was about that prayer in secret in one's inner room and having abandoned worldly goods for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So it's a deeply biblical and very Christocentric practice. Now, when it comes to progress in the spiritual life, remember the very St. Paul that you cited tells us that we must purify ourselves of everything that contaminates flesh or spirit out of reverence for God. That the first step of the spiritual life is, in fact, purification. Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." In a famous dialogue with Abbot Moses, John Cashin asks about the purpose of the monastic life, and Moses responds, well, it's purity of heart, without which no one will see God. And that was the ultimate aim of religious exercises, was that purification of the heart and life that enables a man to see God. And that, of course, involves various ascetical practices so that one can conquer attachment to the flesh. Now, what does the book of Colossians condemn? Therefore, let's read the larger context. Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. So here it's pretty evident that what's being rejected is not fasting as such, but fasting connected to a particular view of the liturgical calendar and religious observance. These are a shadow of the things that were to come in Christ. Don't let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you, for such a person goes into great detail about what they are seen and are puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind. All right, so I think what St. Paul has in mind here is a kind of outward show of religiosity that would think I'm justified, I stand in God's good favor simply in virtue of the mechanics of my bodily posture, having associated with the correct group or performed the proper ritual. These things are of no value for restraining sensual indulgence, which is why Jesus constantly criticizes them in his own ministry.
Okay, well, there you go. And thank you so much for your email. Here's a quick one now from Denny in Wake Forest. Dr. Anders, are you familiar with the United States Grace Force? If so, what are your thoughts?
So, we saw this question come through the stack a few days ago, and
Yes.
I looked the thing up, and if memory serves me correct, it's something like a nonprofit organization that seeks to rally Christian and Catholic men, I think, to prayer for the country and for their families. And it takes a sort of militaristic theme to be, I don't know, sort of prototypically masculine or something to try to inspire people. Beyond that, I know nothing at all. So if it's nothing more than an association that aims to encourage men to pray for their country and for their families, well, I certainly don't object to praying for the country and the family. There may be other things about it that I don't know about, so I don't want to give a ringing endorsement to something that I'm fairly ignorant of, but on the surface, I don't have a problem with praying for the country or one's family.
Denny in Wake Forest, thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we'll talk with Salvador in Lafayette, Louisiana. Lines are open for you as well at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion. Do stay with us.
This is a Did You Know moment with Sandra McDevitt. Did you know there are two images of the Blessed Mother going back to the late 2nd century? The most familiar is in the catacombs of St. Priscilla in Rome, where she is depicted nursing the child Jesus. A man nearby points over her to a star around 150 to 200 AD. Artwork discovered in the 1920s in Syria depicts a woman bending over a well, originally thought to be the Samaritan woman, but because early stories of the Blessed Mother have Gabriel's announcement at a well, the image is now thought to be of the Blessed Mother. Two lines, not visible to the naked eye, reach into her torso, suggesting the Incarnation. Image dated late 2nd century. The images reflect the importance of Mary in the early church. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
Church Pop, features new online Christian content that's fun, informative, and inspirational. You'll learn something new every day. Find Church Pop on Snapchat, Instagram, and on the web at churchpop.com. Church Pop, make holy all things.
Hi, this is Teresa Tomeo. Join me for Catholic Connection as I focus on faith, culture, and media awareness. Tomorrow morning, 9 Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Protecting the sanctity of life. This is EWTN Radio.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Hey, you know, one of the many ways you can receive EWTN programming, whether it's radio or television, is with a Roku device. This allows you to instantly stream EWTN to your TV, and by the way, radio programming as well. All you need is a high-speed internet connection, a TV, and the Roku player. For more information, visit EWTN.com/Roku. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Salvador in Lafayette, Louisiana, listening on the great Christ Our King radio. Hey there, Salvador. What's on your mind today, sir? Salvador in Lafayette, are you there? He's still on hold. There we go. Salvador, how are you today?
I'm doing good. I have a lot on my mind, but one question I've really been asking a lot of people in a piece of the church. It's about humor and holiness. I love to make people laugh. At the same time, I want to be as holy as I can because I don't want to go to hell. I want to go to heaven.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So I really think that holiness and humor, they're certainly not incompatible, but I don't think they're even to be measured on the same continuum. And so you find some incredibly holy people who are very humorous and others who have, very one-dimensional personalities, but the same thing's true at the other end. You'll find great sinners who are uproariously funny, but terrible or quite boring and terrible. I just don't think that they're not on the same sort of scale of evaluation. To my way of looking at it, humor is largely about surprise. It's about observing something true about some person or situation that's not what's expected because of some kind of stereotype or social expectation. And as soon as you point it out, it's impossible not to see. And it takes, something that would otherwise seem serious and makes it appear in an absurd light that nevertheless rings true. And it's that incongruity between the expected and the experience that's brought to your attention by the good and talented humorist, often with a lot of gestures and grimacing and things of that sort and tone of voice that make it so funny. One example that comes to my mind of holiness with humor would be Dr. Ray Guarendi, who's on this network but an hour before this show. So listen to him for a good example of that. Whereas holiness, is not about pointing out incongruities or the experience in light of the expected. It rather is about living the life of charity and the virtues, right? And one of the virtues, of course, is justice. And one part of justice is actually conviviality or amiability. It's sort of the lowest grade of justice, being able to interrelate positively and helpfully with other human beings. And so I think actually the two could be quite easily integrated. I mean, humor can be a great service to people. You can cheer up people who are sad, and comforting the afflicted is one of the spiritual works of mercy. So if you have the gift of humor or funny personality and you're able to sort of bring good cheer to somebody who's down in the dumps, that could be a work of mercy, quite honestly.
Yeah.
It could also be a kind of work of justice, because sometimes you're confronted with situations where maybe a stuffy, officious, and self-important person in a position of authority is lording it over those around him, and if somebody in the back of the room suddenly starts making duck noises, you sort of break the spell, the mystique of a kind of authoritarianism, and bring the whole house rolling down, and you destroy that person's spell that he has over maybe people that are being manipulated. I mean, I could see all kinds of ways humor could be put at the service of justice and the defense of the poor, for example, against exploitation. So I really think they're quite compatible aptitudes, although very, very different, and you can certainly have one without the other, or you could have them both together.
So Salvador should probably concentrate on being Salvador and, live that holy life. But, if you see something funny, well.
So I think there are two ways I could see humor going bad. One would be, a really funny guy or girl is often the life of the party and the center of the attention. And it is possible for that to turn into vanity and self-importance and pride.
Yeah.
And so you need to be on the lookout for that. And the other would be, of course, there could be a kind of, sort of bawdy and earthy humor that can get people's minds going in the wrong direction. So you steer clear of those two vices, but otherwise I think have at it.
Salvador, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. I've often said to my sweet wife, Adrienne, that two of God's greatest gifts are humor and music.
Oh, yeah.
And those really resonate for both she and I. Absolutely.
Yeah. And if you can put them both in the same package, then you've really got something.
There you go. Joseph is a first-time caller in San Antonio, listening on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hello, Joseph. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. I've got a two-part question. Can a person that divorced a Catholic person, because they want to a Catholic to begin with, date another person that could be Catholic, don't know yet, but they're taking Holy Communion at Mass? Is that a mortal sin? And also, should it be reported?
Okay, we got to untangle a number of elements here. So first of all, let me get this straight. You're talking about a Catholic person who is divorced, first of all. Can a divorced Catholic date? All right, well, a lot hangs on that. So are you or is this individual a divorced Catholic who has received an annulment, for example? Or is an annulment pending, or has one even applied for an annulment? Because to be civilly divorced is not the same thing as for the church to recognize that you are no longer married or that you were never validly married. I know people, I have some friends, in fact, who are civilly divorced, but who continue to regard themselves as sacramentally married. And if that's the case, then if you regard yourself as sacramentally married, even though civilly divorced, then of course dating would be entirely inappropriate. So you gotta figure out, where you are with respect to the validity of your marriage. If it is lawful for you to date, can you date a non-Catholic who is nevertheless receiving communion? I think that was the question. In a Catholic church. Well, a non-Catholic should not receive communion in the Catholic church. You asked, is it a mortal sin for a non-Catholic to receive communion in a Catholic church? Well, my guess is a non-Catholic receiving communion in the Catholic church is probably doing so in ignorance. I think once before I became Catholic, years ago when I was in college, I at Loyola University in New Orleans.
Really?
And in what I thought was a courageous show of ecumenism, I went forward in the communion line because no one had ever told me not to, right? And it was years later that I began to figure out how not okay that was. But no one told me, and so it wasn't sinful in my case because I acted in complete ignorance, and I had no way of not knowing that I shouldn't have done that. But a non-Catholic shouldn't receive communion in a Catholic church and should be informed of that. And then if they act against that instruction, then we have to bring in the question of some moral culpability. So, should it be reported? Well, like I said, I do think you ought to let person know that they're not to receive communion if they're not Catholic.
Yeah. Is that helpful for you, Joseph?
Very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. It is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Two lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Chris is listening in Orange County, California, also on Sirius XM, channel 130. Hey there, Chris. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hey, Dr. Anders. This week, or yesterday, we had the centurion saying, the centurion's friend saying, we owe him a favor. He built the synagogue for us. But in those days, when this took place, historically, I don't think there was any synagogues around, or at least that's what I thought the priest was saying. And so I'm kind of curious, did Luke know when he wrote the gospel that this centurion did something very good for the locality, or how do you see that?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. So there were, of course, synagogues in the first century, although their use was different from what you would find in a synagogue today. So the religion that we call Judaism has undergone massive historical development over time, and it is anachronistic to imagine that what your Orthodox, conservative, or Reformed Jewish friends are doing on Saturday morning at their local synagogue is somehow that you can somehow copy and paste that to the first century, or even more to say the time of the Babylonian exile. I mean, Judaism as we know it today is a development every bit as much as Christianity is a development of Hebrew faith from say like the Davidic era. And the Talmud, I mean, the Jewish law and commentary that is now pretty much this standard interpretive framework for modern Judaism, doesn't really come into its own until, say, about the 5th century A.D. in Babylon. And so there's a pretty substantial prehistory there that has to be taken into consideration. But there were gathering places for Jews to read the law and to undergo rites of purification and things like that we call synagogues. And so, yes, they were social institutions that were important at the time, and a Roman centurion who built one out of his own funds would be doing a work of benevolence for the Jewish community. So probably the centurion in question was what they called a God-fearer, which is to say a Gentile who had come to believe in the God of Israel but had not taken the step of circumcising himself so as to become fully integrated into the Jewish community. And there are fairly obvious reasons why a Gentile might hold back from circumcision but would otherwise want to be associated with the patrimony of Israel.
Very good. And Chris, thank you so much for your call. I appreciate you checking in from Orange County. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Scott's watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Scott says, if possible, can you clear up what the Pope meant with his comments about, quote, paths to heaven from his recent trip to Singapore?
Yeah, thanks. So I have absolutely no idea what the Pope intended, and I don't even pretend to be able to parse his words because they weren't precise and he didn't elaborate. And so I don't know what his underlying theology of redemption is that's implied there. I can, however, clarify a sense in which the Pope's words could be taken charitably and a sense in which they could be taken without charity.
All right.
Okay? So St. Bonaventure, just to take one Catholic doctor at more or less at random, in his book, The Mind's Journey into God, makes the enticing statement that the world, that is to say all of it, that includes beetles, the world is a ladder ascending to God. Namely, that through the elements of the created world, and that would include things like human culture and beetles, that one can discern, in Bonaventure's mind, the marks of the Blessed Trinity. That there is sufficient evidence woven into the fabric of creation that one might mount up through contemplation to a true knowledge of God. But what prevents that from being effective, according to St. Bonaventure, is that we're so mired in concupiscence that we can't really act on that. We can't make that serviceable to ourselves, that knowledge that's woven into the fabric of reality without the grace of God. A similar argument was made by St. Augustine. If you've ever read his Confessions in Book 7, I think, he talks about having encountered the works of the Platonists. So now we're not talking about beetles, we're talking about human culture and philosophy, and how they essentially gave him wings, and they liberated him from his intellectual bondage to matter, and presented to him the idea of a sort of transcendent beauty, both epistemological and moral, and to the idea of union with an immaterial and omnipresent God, which he found absolutely captivating. But he had a problem. As much as he was attracted to that idea of God and to Platonic philosophy, that he never abandoned, he just incorporated it later into Christianity, he found that it didn't give him the moral power to actually live the virtuous life that the Platonists were advocating. All right, and so for both Augustine and for Bonaventure, the solution to that problem is Jesus. That Jesus gives you the power to live the good that nature testifies to. And now, what does the Catholic faith teach today? What if you are born outside the boundaries of the historic Christian faith, such that you have no access to the name of Jesus or to the sacraments? Well, the church teaches that God makes the offer of grace to every single living human being. And that offer of grace, in some way potentially known only to God, can, as it were, actualize what is evident to you about God and the moral life from the natural world or from human culture. And that's all standard Catholic teaching. So it is theoretically possible for someone who is not a Catholic and is born in some other tradition to come to salvation. But they would come to salvation not necessarily because of, but rather in spite of, the erroneous parts of their own tradition. So, let's take, for example, I'll just pick one at random. Let's take Buddhism, which is very popular in the Western world today. Well, Buddhism says some stuff that's not true about God and the afterlife and the spiritual journey and spiritual quest. It says some stuff in there that's not true. Well, the not true parts aren't going to connect you to God. But it also says some stuff that's true, like value compassion and don't kill people and don't commit adultery and don't get intoxicated and that sort of thing. Well, those are good parts. Those are good parts, right?
Yes.
And the Catholic position has always been that you can get a lot of mileage out of the good parts, whatever your tradition is. Now, some traditions have got more good parts than others. And one of my favorite whipping boys on this show, and I've mentioned it before, is, let's say, Aztec temple ritual that was centered on human sacrifice, and the people being sacrificed were slaves taken in imperialistic warfare. That's not one of the good parts.
No.
Not one of the good parts. So you're not going to be saved through those rites.
There you go. Scott, thanks for watching us on YouTube this afternoon. In a moment, we'll talk with Paul, a first-time caller from Wisconsin, Mike in Jones, Oklahoma. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Stay with us.
Somehow we've got it in our heads that simple or unnoticed work is a waste of time. In the words of Mike Rowe, we've declared war on work. We've created a caste system where everyone from plumbers to garbage men are at the bottom and Hollywood stars are at the top. Maybe that's why so many new parents get depressed. I'm just cleaning poop and cooking dinners now. Simple work. How's that matter? Maybe I don't matter. Ever stop and think that Jesus spent most of his life doing manual labor? The God of the universe spent most of his life as a small-town carpenter. Look, we can get by without the rich and famous, but without people to remove our trash, raise our food, and change the diapers, the gears of human history would come to a grinding halt. I think maybe our vision of what matters is off, and we become less happy as people and less stable as a society because of it. That quiet, often unnoticed work you do every day, it matters a lot. And so do you. This is Chris Stefanik from reallifecatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
You need courage to stand up and be Christian, and stand up and be a real Catholic, not a divided Catholic, not one who lives by half-truths or preaches lies. Follow the church. Follow the magisterium. You can't go wrong.
Mother Angelica Live Classics. Tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Television and Radio.
EWTN has its own official YouTube channel with tens of thousands of videos covering just about every conceivable topic of interest to Catholics. And best of all, it's free. When you go to YouTube, search EWTN.
Matt Swaim here. Tomorrow on the Sunrise Morning Show, we'll talk to canon lawyer Father Philip Michael Tangora and get you all the latest news, weather, sports, and a whole lot more. Now back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Quick reminder here, coming up next on most of these EWTN stations, it is Open Line Tuesday with Father Wade Menezes of the Fathers of Mercy. He is here to answer your questions. That's coming up next at 3 p.m. Eastern on most of these EWTN stations. Let's go now to Mike in Jones, Oklahoma, listening on the great Oklahoma Catholic Broadcasting. Mike, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, sir. I was wanting to ask a little guidance, I guess, with a stepdaughter.
Okay.
we're just having a lot of problems with her. She'll go over to her dad. She comes back, and she's just almost like a totally different person. She's completely disrespectful. She lies to her mom, about absolutely everything. We moved her out of one school because she got into trouble, and 3 weeks into the new school, she's in trouble again. I don't know what to do with her. I don't know what else to do. I've tried to do everything to show her, that there's a better life out there than this. We go to church. We take her, she wants to go do something to a water park or Orlando, Florida to Disney. Absolutely, we've done it. But it's just like we can't reach her.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. And I would say that you've got a very short window of time to address a very serious issue. And water parks and Disney are not going to get the job done at all. And I think that the core of your solution is, first of all, stop lecturing the daughter on the better life. It is a complete and total waste of time. She doesn't care. She won't listen. Stop talking, stop talking, stop talking. Here's what you do instead, in my judgment. You decide what standard of behavior is appropriate for your home. Like, don't talk back to your mother, for example, would be a rule, all right?
Yep.
You decide in advance what the consequences are for talking back to mother. And maybe it's you're deprived of your cell phone, or you don't get to go out on Friday night, or whatever, something that is going to have a meaningful effect on her sense of flourishing and well-being. You articulate the policy. You're not to talk back to your mother. You are to be in bed by 10 p.m. and up by 7. You are to have your homework done by 9 p.m., whatever the list of behaviors are that's appropriate. You are not to sit at the dinner table and roll your eyes and stare at the ceiling and throw corn cobs at us, whatever it might be, right? And if you do, the consequence will be initially that, you lose your cell phone for a week, or you lose your telephone privileges for a week.
And no more corn.
And no more corn, or whatever it might be,
yes.
Right? And we're not going to discuss it anymore, right? And that's just the end of the story, right? And then you don't bring up the rule, and you don't bring up the consequences until there's an infraction. And let's say, for example, that the consequence is you don't get to go out on Friday night, and she does this infraction on Monday. Is do not engage, do not engage, do not engage. You say what you say. All you do is present the consequence, and you walk away. Here's why this is the proper strategy. The consequence does the teaching, not you. And that way you are able to keep your interactions with the child pleasant and affirming. I love you. I care about you. You're great. Here's an extra bowl of ice cream with no corn on top, whatever, okay? And so every interaction you have is positive with the child, but the standards are rock solid, clear, and rigidly enforced. Now, what happens most of the time instead is you come on with 1,000 lectures about all the behaviors that need to change and all the things that are going to happen if you don't change, and then the parent does nothing. The child misbehaves in the standard way. All the parent does is yakety yak, 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 and then turns around and takes the kid to Sally's house. Look, I've got 5 children, 2 grandchildren. I've done this. I have failed every way you can possibly fail as a parent by doing exactly what I'm telling you I now know I should not have done. And I've learned better, and I do better now with my younger people, right? And so that's the path forward. It's not through Disney World trips. That's it, okay? And I don't draw any comparisons to her father's house, right? You're probably bound by some kind of court order. You have to be in visitation, and if you can't say some nice and positive thing about the father, then you could just say, you know what, I'm not in a position to discuss your father or his parenting techniques. I just can't discuss it.
Yeah.
But in this house, this is what we do, and changing the environment's not going to work. Changing schools isn't going to work. These things aren't going to work. All right. But you need an opportunity to show compassion and love and affirmation because the kid's probably miserable. right? Probably utterly miserable. So you got to get the behavior thing under control. Now, I've given you my piece of wisdom. I'd also like you to read some stuff by James Stenson, a Catholic parenting author who Father Mark Mary turned me on to 20 years ago, who I think has a lot of wise things to say. He has a book called The Father Protector, by the way, you might find very helpful. He's got other books as well, but that's a good one to start with. The other resource I want you to do is I'm glad you called my show, but I want you to call back and talk to Dr. Ray Garendi tomorrow, right? And we got a guy in EWTN. This is his jam, man. This is his jam all day long. Yeah. And I think he'll tell you similar things that I've told you, but with a few more insights. He's a clinical psychologist who does this for a living. I mostly talk about theology. So parenthood, at which I have the experience of miserable failure, that's my main qualification, is not having been a particularly successful one all the time. But Dr. Ray will put you straight as well. So that ought to get you going. But definitely call back and listen to rebroadcasts of the Doctor's End with Dr. Ray. Yeah. Because you'll find hundreds of parents, well, thousands really over the years, that have had very similar problems. And you start listening to the advice over and over and over again, it begins to sink in. You start being able to actualize it.
Mike, a great call. Thanks so much for checking in with us. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Last call for your call at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Here is Brian now in Boston listening on the EWTN app, a free download, I might add. Hello, Brian. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. I know you were answering the thing about the Pope's path. My brother wrote me that when the Pope said there's only one God and each of us has their own language, whether it's Greek, or whether it's Sikh or Muslim, Hindu, Christian. And my brother said that's a pluralism, and that also troubling trajectory of the Roman Catholic Church as a whole. I take issue with the latter, but I don't know how to respond to his calling it a pluralism, because I know the Muslims don't believe in the Trinity. So in that sense, could it also sort of hinge upon being pantheism? I don't know.
Yeah, thanks. So let me clarify a few points. And again, like parsing Pope Francis can be difficult sometimes because he speaks off the cuff and in imprecise ways. It is hard to know exactly. He's not speaking with the precision of a theologian sometimes in these things. So it's hard to know exactly what he was on about. And that's just his pastoral style. But I can definitely clarify the teaching of the Catholic faith, and I can answer these questions. That's not hard at all. So there are many things about other religions that are objectively harmful. So for example, there are versions of Islam, not all of them to be sure, that take the surah on women from the Quran quite literally and believe that it is perfectly legitimate to take sex slaves in warfare. I mean, this is why this happened to the Yazidi women in particular in Syria and Iraq when ISIS came and did their little thing over there, their big thing over there, and they were internet sites where you could buy Yazidi women, right? That ISIS had taken in warfare. That's really not good. I mean, there's no parsing that to go, yeah, this is a path to God. No, it isn't. That's not a path to God. This is a grave violation of human dignity. And I could, you could go through world religions and you could pick out elements from different traditions that are really quite harmful and run flat contrary to the ultimate command of the love of God and neighbor and the life of virtue. And so being Catholic does not obligate you to affirm everything that anybody has ever said about the divine. Far from it. I mean, Catholicism is grounded in a critique of idolatry and of evil religion. And it's woven throughout the doctrines of the New Testament and the history of the Catholic faith. So we are not obligated to accept anything that anybody says just because they're sincere. A lot of sincere people go to hell, right? On the other hand, it is also true that insofar as we are alive and human, that we are made in the image of God, and there is something intrinsically redeemable about the human person, and that it is almost unthinkable no truth in their lifetime. Yeah, we have a capacity for truth. It's part of our spiritual nature. It's part of what makes us made in God's likeness and image. And so just as I can find fault with other religious traditions, and quite frankly with superstitious Catholics, I can also find things that I can affirm. The Golden Rule is not universally, but nigh unto universally recognized as a moral principle. There are exceptions, but you will find the Golden Rule represented in many, many cultures throughout the world. It's hard to do better than the Golden Rule when it comes to, a basis for ethical life. And the Catholic position is that there are elements elements of truth and sanctification in other traditions. That's not universalism, because those elements had better bring you to the right orientation. That is to say, they had better bring you to genuine love of God and neighbor in the life of virtue. If they bring you to something other than that, then it's not God you're aiming at.
Yeah.
You see, right? And if you are in another religious tradition and you lay hold of some of the positive elements, it is in spite of, not because of, the erroneous elements. And it is perfectly legitimate to parse those differences and to distinguish between the things that I can affirm and the things that I can't affirm. Is that making sense to you?
Yes, it does.
All right. Brian, thank you so much for your call today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Hey, our friends listening to us in East Central Texas need to hear from you this week. And I mean, chop, chop. Armor of God Catholic Radio celebrating, they are airing their fall pledge drive starting today, going through Thursday. So if you're listening in Temple, Texas, or Killeen, or Fort Hood, or anywhere, be sure to support your EWTN Catholic radio station. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Here's a question we received from a rookie driver watching us on YouTube today. He says, or she says, I have a Southern Baptist friend who went through seminary and is a pastor. He says he loves the writings of the church fathers like Augustine, Aquinas, Ignatius, etc. How can he give credit to them but remain Protestant?
Yeah, so actually this is really woven into the history of Protestantism, that in the 16th century, the early Protestants recognized that they were breaking with the Church of history. And because they had been raised Catholic and they knew history, they saw that as objectively a problem, as something that needed to be polemically addressed. And so they worked out a theology of their own history where they claimed to be recovering antiquity, and they argued that it was the Catholic Church rather than they who had essentially split away. And so they saw themselves, they claimed that they were basically blowing away the smoke of papal tradition and superstition to recover the pure, pristine gospel that lay beneath it. Now, I think that was a perfectly spurious argument, and I don't buy it, but that was the line. And so they were avid readers of Augustine and Ambrose and Jerome and Chrysostom, and they quote them constantly. And they would glom onto anything they could find in the Fathers, that taken out of context, that they could try to render in a Protestant idiom. So that was very much part of their apologetical method. And if you read, say, the writings of Calvin, for example, you're going to find tens of thousands of citations from John of Damascus, even Bernard of Clairvaux, from the Scholastics, from Lombard, from Thomas, from Scotus, many citations of Augustine, Athanasius. I mean, they were students of history, and they tried to work out a theology of history to justify the Reformation. Now, like I said, I didn't buy the argument, and I started like that in my own academic career. I was a historian of the Reformation. And I decided that my particular path into the Reformation was going to be through patristic and late medieval studies. And so I really tried to understand the development of the Protestant tradition in light of its late medieval and ancient antecedents. And I read all that literature. I read the secondary literature on that at great length. And I eventually came to the conclusion that it was just wrong. That this was a polemical and highly selective reading of history, and it wasn't faithful to the mind of the Fathers. It's not that there weren't elements that they could cherry pick, but that the sort of warp and woof, the essence, the major thrust, the disposition of the Fathers was Catholic, and it wasn't Protestant at all. And the core theological doctrines, above all, were Catholic. And for me, none was more important than Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone, because the Protestant tradition had said that's the doctrine on which the church stands or falls. You give that up, you give up the whole ghost. So I went diving through history trying to find justification by faith alone as Luther understood it in the writings of the Fathers, and it is magnificently absent. It is just, it is not there. It is flat out contradicted. And it wasn't just my conclusion. I mean, I was reading the best Protestant historians, and in particular Alistair McGrath, Oxford theologian, evangelical Anglican, who wrote a 2-volume history called Justitia Dei, A History of the Doctrine of Justification. It's probably the definitive secondary source on the subject in the English language, and he flat out tells you Yep, they weren't Lutheran. I mean, they were Augustinian, and Luther's doctrine was a complete theological novelty. You know, a generation earlier, T.F. Torrance, his book on the doctrine of grace and the Apostolic Fathers, von Harnack's History of Dogma. I mean, you name it. Major Protestant historians of doctrine come to the same conclusion.
These are serious folks.
These are heavy hitting scholars
Yeah.
that are highly regarded Protestant authorities that say, yeah, this is Jaroslav Pelikan of Yale University. I mean, the Protestants did not hold the fundamental, the fathers of the church fundamentally did not hold the Protestant doctrines. But trying to argue otherwise is a standard piece of Protestant polemics.
There you go. Appreciate your question via YouTube today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Glad you could join us. Here is Marshall now in Prattville, Alabama, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hey, Marshall, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, two quick questions. I grew up with Thomas Merton. I wanted to get your take on his dialogue with Buddhist monks. You were talking about possible harmful, and also another quick question that came up. Do you know of any mainline Protestant denominations that could be harmful? I'm a convert from Methodism.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So Merton is an interesting character, and for many people, Merton is a kind of halfway house on the way into a deeper engagement with the Catholic mystical tradition. I know that he was for me. So before I was Catholic, I read The Seven-Story Mountain, and lots of people have become Catholic because they read The Seven-Story Mountain. I know people who have become Catholic because they read The Seven-Story Mountain. And it is a magnificent piece of English prose. Martin was a very talented writer, and I would encourage anybody to go read Seven-Story Mountain. I mean, he's not a saint, and he's not a doctor of the church, and it's not infallible, but it's a very well-written and well-engaging memoir about one man's discovery of the monastic path, and I would not discourage you from reading it. And, you know, as I dove more deeply into Merton, I got more interested in Catholic monasticism. And his book, Contemplation in a World of Action, was another one that I found very helpful. And someplace in Merton's corpus, I remember coming across a passage where he said, and this sounds like a Zen koan, but it's not a Zen koan, and I'll explain it in a minute. He makes the statement that the first thing a monk needs to learn is that he's not a monk. And that's not a paradox. He's not contradicting himself. What he meant by that is that if you go into monasticism thinking, I'm really cool because I wear funny robes, right? Like, God likes me because I live in community and I get up and pray at 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, where you think that the thing about being a monk is that I'm cool because I'm a monk and God thinks I'm cool because I'm a monk. That if you do that, you've missed the point of monastic life. That the point of monastic life is to divest yourself of artificial persona. You know, we go through so much of our life, particularly if we're young people, trying to adopt all these roles so that people will like us, they'll respect us, we'll respect ourselves. Dad was an engineer, so I'm going to become an engineer. Or, you know, everybody thinks I should be great at sports, so I'm going to be great at sports. And you give yourself to these things because other people want you to, and you really alienate yourself from the deepest areas of your own personality. And that's not a path for sanctification, because sanctification begins with self-knowledge and humility. And you got to figure out what's wrong with who I am inside, and how do I conform the personality that God gave me more and more to Jesus. And so that's the point of monastic life, is to divest myself of all these worldly attachments and stand naked, you know, bare in front of God, and let myself in my nothingness be reshaped in the image of Christ. And so that kind of insight, where I began to see that I'm raised to have a recognition of the reality of sin in my life. I was raised a Presbyterian, but I didn't quite grasp the depth of the interior purification that was available to the human person until I began to read Catholic monastic and spiritual literature. And Merton opened the door for me to think in those terms, and to realize that there was a deeper purification of the personality that could take place than what I had been accustomed to. So Merton was very helpful to me. Now, you know, Merton was not perfect, and in later life, you know, he did some other things that folks have found a little bit, off-putting or disturbing, and maybe he went off the bad path. I think there was a question about his engagement with Buddhism. I think Merton was an intellectually curious person. There is nothing intrinsically wrong in a Catholic reading the literature of another religious tradition. I mean, heaven knows that I wouldn't have become Catholic if I hadn't been open to reading the literature of another Christian tradition and of other traditions as well. You know, as I began to read really, really widely across religious traditions, I began to see that my Presbyterianism wasn't the only one, and that a kind of critical engagement with wisdom traditions was really helpful to me, and it opened my eyes to some of the superstition in my own tradition. And eventually that path led me to Catholicism. And as a Catholic, I continue to read widely in other traditions. And I've read in Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and Judaism and Islam. And that's just part of my intellectual path, you know. But there's a danger. And the danger is that, you know, novelty is attractive. And it's possible to have a kind of naive enthusiasm for a new topic. And I do think that Merton fell prey to that. So he was in the 1960s when Merton was writing. The West's engagement with Buddhism was very, very new, and there weren't a lot of Western scholars of Buddhism, and we didn't have critical texts and good translations and things like that. And so it was easy for him, I think, to be snookered, to be hoodwinked by some salesmen for the tradition that didn't give him a really objective encounter. And so, I mean, I've read some of Merton's Asian Journal, for example, and I've watched his engagement, say, for example, with Theravada Buddhism, and it strikes me today as tremendously naive compared to what is available in any academic library today. I mean, I know more about Buddhism, I think, probably than Merton did, right? He saw more of it firsthand. He went and visited monasteries and stuff, but like just the texts that are available to him were pretty poor. And so he chose some poor bedfellows. He got to be friends with some people that turned out to be real charlatans that took advantage of him and stuff like that. So you just kind of watch out for that naivete. But there are better engagements, Catholic engagements with Buddhism. I mean, Henri de Lubac, who became a cardinal of the Catholic Church and was highly influential at the Second Vatican Council, and his cause is currently being pursued by the Episcopal Conference of France, for example. I mean, he's a much more celebrated character than Merton is. Wrote extensively about Buddhism as a Catholic, particularly the Pure Land tradition of the Mahayana school. So, I mean, there's ways you can engage that material and not be naive and gullible, right?
Okay.
I think sometimes Merton was naive and gullible.
Marshall, thanks so much for your call from Prattville. Quick question here. This is from M, who says, Dr. Anders, how do Protestants justify or interpret the phrase communion of saints? That's in the Apostles' Creed. Do they even believe in communion of saints when many denominations don't have communion?
Yeah, right. So for a Protestant, communion in that context doesn't necessarily refer to the sacrament of Holy Communion.
Okay.
It means fellowship with.
Oh, okay.
And the way many Protestants would understand the doctrine of the communion of the saints is either the saints on earth, because they understand all Christians to be saints in some respect, right? Anybody who's been baptized has been sanctified in some respect, and so it would be the fellowship of the church, the Christian believers on earth. Or in a more extended sense, they would say, you know, the fellowship with the saints in heaven when we die and are received into glory. What they would rule out would be, say, the intercession of the saints and the cult of saints, that is, their veneration and prayer to saints. They reject that.
Okay. And M, thanks so much for your letter and for your kind words about the show. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday right here on EWTN Radio, 2 p.m. for our live broadcast. You can check out the podcast 24 hours a day by going to EWTN.com, click on the radio box, and then look for the words Podcast Central. Very close. I think we have 99 podcasts up there now. Surely another one will come along. Podcast Central, just a fantastic wealth of information and a great way to learn more about your faith. Do check it out. And EWTN's Call to Communion is right there with the best of them. Until next time, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. We will see you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show.
We'll talk to canon lawyer Father Philip Michaels and chat with Father Rob Jack from the Archdiocese